Hello everyone, bonjour à toutes et à tous. My name is Stephen Noble and I'm an associate professor at the Université de Lille in France, where I teach translation and philosophy. Je m'appelle Stephen Noble, je suis maître de conférence à l'Université de Lille en France, où j'enseigne la traduction et la philosophie. This is the first time in my life that I've done anything like this, not only putting myself in front of a camera to be filmed, but doing so in order to record a paper that would normally be read at a conference. But because we've been doing lots of things we've never done before since March 2020, at least there's some coherence. I'd like to say, first of all, that this recording is being made for the exclusive purpose of a conference on translation and philosophy organised at the University of Vienna in Austria and the University of East Anglia in England by Dr. Alice Leal and Dr. Philip Wilson, respectively. Under no circumstances can it be used for any other purpose without the prior approval of the person who wrote it and recorded it. I'd like to thank Dr. Leal and Dr. Wilson, first of all, for organising the conference and for all the work they're putting into it. And I'd also like to thank them for inviting me to speak. I'm very glad to be doing so, and I look forward to listening to all the other contributions and to participating in the discussions with all the other contributors at the beginning of September. The piece of work I'm going to present has developed a little from my original intentions, as these things sometimes do, and I'm going to be concentrating more on the relationship between translation and philosophy and how we can understand this relationship. So, here we go. No meaningful philosophical discussion can be conducted for long before the participants invoke, wittingly or not, ideas or concepts which have been passed down to them from unfamiliar lands and foreign languages, often far off in time and place. Although one does not require any knowledge of the history of philosophy or of the languages in which it has been conducted to engage in philosophical debate, as soon as one does so, the rich chronicle of the concepts and arguments in play will inevitably come to loom closely in the background. A discussion about the nature of selfhood, for example, might well broach, before too long, the apparent opposition between some substance such as mind and some other substance such as body, an opposition about which the concepts and arguments formulated by René Descartes, writing both in 17th century French and in scholastic Latin, remain instructive today. In a similar manner, any discussion about ethics might easily oscillate between moral principles construed in more pragmatic terms by virtue of consequentialist postulates similar to those first developed by Jeremy Bentham in the language native to 18th and 19th century England, and a more absolute and categorical understanding of such principles similar to that developed by Immanuel Kant in the German language of 18th century Prussia. Whatever the philosophical subject at hand might be, it is rare that the concepts at stake do not have a long, diverse, and sometimes even tangled linguistic heritage. And yet, there are perhaps fewer aspects of philosophy which are so central to its development, but which have generated so little attention amongst its practitioners, than translation. In spite of their insatiable curiosity and their love of wisdom about all aspects of the world around them, philosophers have generally overlooked the sinuous linguistic paths through which the fundamental elements of their vocabulary have travelled to them. Indeed, because of the essential role which translation has played in the development of the discipline we know today as philosophy, and as a result of the scant attention the practice has received from the vast majority of philosophers to whom it is so central, the relationship between translation and philosophy is far from straightforward and is fraught with difficulties. Before going any further and examining this relationship more closely, it can be instructive to clarify some of the salient points which condition it, as well as some of the distinctions between the two practices. Distinctions which are sometimes simple, sometimes unexpected, yet always enlightening. Let us begin with philosophy itself. First of all, when understood in some of its widest senses, the term philosophy stands for, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, and I quote, the love, study, or pursuit of wisdom, truth, or knowledge, or again, I quote, rational inquiry or argument as opposed to divinely revealed knowledge. When construed in such a fashion, it can be said that philosophy has existed and has been practiced all over the world for millennia. Furthermore, not only have human beings philosophized for thousands of years, but, following these meanings, the object of their philosophizing constitutes a wide field of knowledge indeed. The considerable scope of philosophical inquiry was made clear in the 3rd century by Diogenes Laertius in his Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. In Book 2 of this work, he defines 3 broad divisions of the practice: natural, ethical, and dialectic, which, between them, cover a large portion of all human inquiry. This general meaning of the term philosophy held sway in the Western world roughly until the 17th and 18th centuries, at the time of the scientific revolution, when its scope began to grow narrower. As far as translation is concerned, it is also, and this point must not be forgotten, a very ancient human activity. We could easily surmise that, from the time when there were 2 or more languages, people sought to translate between them. In this sense, it is highly possible that the practice of translation even precedes that of philosophy. As Paul Ricoeur writes, in French first, c'est parce que les hommes parlent des langues différentes que la traduction existe. In English, it is because men speak different languages that translation exists. On the other hand, however, translation understood as a specific discipline and as a field of academic study is, in sharp contrast to philosophy, one of the youngest in existence. It is customary to situate its beginnings very recently, in the second half of the 20th century, with a major turning point being the presentation by James Holmes of his paper entitled The Name and Nature of Translation Studies in Copenhagen in 1972. There have been many advances since this time, but it nevertheless remains true that the discipline of translation studies, especially when compared to philosophy, has shallow, slender roots. But it must not be forgotten that this is in stark contrast to translation understood as a human activity, which is, and as we have stated, at the very least as ancient as philosophy itself. These introductory remarks make it possible to raise a question which, although it may seem simple, is actually elementary and essential. Why has translation, such an ancient human activity, attracted the attention of philosophers so little, especially since the practice plays such an undeniable and central role in the pursuit of their calling? A hint of an answer to this question has been suggested by Lawrence Venuti in his book The Scandals of Translation, and it is this answer and its implications which I would now like to examine. In Chapter 6, entitled quite simply Philosophy, Venuti analyzes different examples of translations of philosophical works, including books by Plato, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger. The main discussion, and by far the most in-depth, takes as its object the English translation of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. The central example is not insignificant, for it must be said that Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations constitutes an atypical case in the world of philosophical publishing, and, surprisingly, this is a point that Venuti does not mention. It's worth taking a moment to clarify what is at issue. The first edition of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations in its original German was published in 1953, 2 years after the author's death. However, contrary to what is customary practice when a book is published initially, the work was not, strictly speaking, a unilingual publication. It was in fact a bilingual edition. In the book, Wittgenstein's German text is printed on the left-hand side, and on the facing page, in parallel and synchronized with the original, the reader finds the English translation. As we know, the translation was carried out not only by a philosopher, but by one of Wittgenstein's former students, who had become a friend, Elizabeth Anscombe. The privileged place which Anscombe's work occupies, namely, appearing alongside and in the very same place as the original text, as well as the proximity of the translator to the author, would appear to grant it a certain unquestionable authority. It should be noted that other texts of German philosophy were printed in the United Kingdom during this general period, with an English translation appearing on the facing page. For example, 1950 brought the publication of a bilingual edition of Frege's The Foundations of Arithmetic, translated by John Austin, and somewhat earlier, in 1922, Wittgenstein's Tractatus was printed in a bilingual edition with the translation by Charles Ogden and Frank Ramsey, which was reviewed in part by the author himself. But it is important to underline that both of these texts had been previously published in their native German. This is not the case with Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. It is extremely rare, especially for a book that has taken on such philosophical importance, that it should appear in its first original edition as a bilingual work. This form of bilingual philosophical publication constitutes an essential characteristic of the book, which makes it a significant example for any study of the translation of philosophy and the manner in which the philosophy in question has been received within the two linguistic communities. It is surprising that Venuti does not explore this important particularity relating to the initial bilingual publication of the philosophical investigations. Be that as it may, after having analysed certain traits of Elizabeth Anscombe's English translation of the philosophical investigations, Venuti arrives at the following conclusion. It has been quoted on a number of occasions, but even though it is usually quoted approvingly, it is seldom quoted in full or seldom analysed in any manner whatsoever. Venuti writes as follows. Translation, and I quote, "Translation remains the dark secret of philosophy precisely because the remainder shatters the bedrock assumption of this project in its modern academic form, the stability and authority of the philosophical subject as an autonomous agent of reflection." End quote. The first part of the passage is relatively straightforward, and although it may be open to different interpretations, it is not difficult to understand. It affirms that translation remains obscure and impenetrable to philosophy and is somehow hidden or concealed from it. It is a dark secret. However, the second part of the passage, which provides a reason for this state of affairs, is much less clear. Indeed, a certain obscurity surrounds Venuti's conclusion precisely because he bases it on the ideas of another author without clarifying what he is doing for the reader. In fact, he appropriates a concept called the remainder, which was first formulated by the French linguist Jean-Jacques Le Cercle, who worked at the same university as Paul Ricoeur, Université de Paris X, Nanterre, in a book he wrote and published initially in English in 1990 entitled The Violence of Language. But what precisely is the remainder, and how, if at all, might it help us understand why translation has so far escaped the grasp of philosophy? According to Jean-Jacques Le Cercle, the remainder resembles or has affinities to a concept formulated by Jacques Lacan called, in French, la langue. The term la langue is a neologism which combines two words. First, the definite article la or the, and secondly, the noun langue, which can mean tongue or language, where the latter is understood as any individual system of communication shared by a certain community, and not in the more general sense of a method of human communication, which in French is langage. Lacan's concept conveys the idea that the profound meaning of any aspect of the linguistic phenomenon is not exhausted in the sum of the linguistic elements by which it is expressed and of which it is solely composed. As another French linguist, Jean-Claude Milner, has suggested, the concept of la langue is developed to help us understand the fact that the meaning of language is not expressed fully in or through the signifier. Venuti himself appears to take for granted the legitimacy of this concept, as well as its acceptance by the reader, and he provides almost no explanation in the book. The only remark he makes is brief and concise. And I quote, "Any language use is prone to the unpredictable variation of the remainder, the collective force of linguistic forms that outstrips any individual's control and complicates intended meanings." This is a significant claim to make, and a significant concept to use, especially for someone writing in English. For any understanding of language which incorporates such a concept stands in opposition, almost diametrically so, to the traditional and more conventional way of understanding how language functions. Following a commonly accepted understanding of language, the phenomenon is construed much like a tool, notably a tool for communication, one which we appropriate, which we use, and which we master. This is an understanding of language which can be traced right back to the work of John Locke, in particular to Book 3 of an essay concerning human understanding. For Locke, the primary function of language is to allow us to express our thoughts and to convey our knowledge to others, and, if we do not manage to do so, language is either deficient in some manner or has been used improperly, or, as Locke says, it has been abused. This very brief definition of Locke's understanding of language is important because the fundamental tenets he outlined in an essay concerning human understanding remain pertinent to many and in many disciplines today. It helps us to grasp the breadth of the gap which exists between a more conventional understanding of the linguistic phenomenon and the one which is espoused by writers such as Lawrence Venuti and Jean-Jacques Le Cercle. Such understandings are based on interpretations which were first developed in the 20th century by philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who vigorously challenges the understanding of language as merely an instrument used for the communication of preformed ideas or thoughts. According to such thinkers, the so-called deficiencies, which one might be tempted to say exist in language when communication is difficult or when it fails, situations which we all know very well, cannot be characterized as inherent flaws or weaknesses. On the contrary, they are actually construed as an integral part of the linguistic phenomenon and help to define it positively, demonstrating that, as we have noted, meanings are not conditioned definitively by the words or the signifiers through which they are expressed. Other factors come into play in the very constitution of meaning. A radical transformation therefore occurs not only in our way of understanding language, but also in our relation to the phenomenon itself. For example, according to Jean-Jacques Le Cercle, and I quote, first in French, "Le sujet n'est plus maître de sa langue." In English, the subject is no longer the master of language. To say it differently, and this time in the words of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, again first in French, "Le langage nous dépasse." In English, language surpasses us. The idea that there might exist pure thoughts which pre-exist their verbal expression is eclipsed. Henceforth, and as Merleau-Ponty affirms again, what is signified exceeds the signifier. It is, very precisely, fundamental ideas such as these, which tell us that, as speaking subjects, we are no longer masters of a language, that our language can escape us, and that words can express more and different meanings than they seem initially to imply, which make it possible for us to understand fully the meaning of the concept of remainder, upon which Venuti bases his claim that translation remains the dark secret of philosophy. The remainder, then, is in some sense akin to a profusion of meaning, which exists by virtue of the very material conditions of language itself, namely by virtue of the fact that a language is part of a defined culture and that it is comprised of a particular grammar, vocabulary, and conceptual framework, all of which are untranslatable as such into another system of written signs. And the remainder is not simply present in translation, but it exists in each language taken individually, before any attempt is made to translate. According to Venuti, the presence of the remainder is even more important when it comes to translation because the concept facilitates a clearer understanding of the divergences which can develop between the original and its renditions in other languages. Referring directly to the English translation of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, Venuti writes, "Reading for the," and I quote, "reading for the remainder means focusing on the linguistic and cultural differences that English inscribes in the German text, and then considering the reconstitution of Wittgenstein's ideas." By doing so, and this is one of the most crucial points of his analysis, with which you can agree or disagree, Venuti purports to show that the author of the German version of the Philosophical Investigations is in some way other than the author who transpires through the English translation, and therefore that the stability and the authority of the unique subject identified as Ludwig Wittgenstein have been shaken and undermined, very precisely through the process of translation. If it is undeniable that what one French linguist, Monique de Mathias-Viviès, has aptly called the constitutive instability of language, contributes to the transformation of the meaning, or rather the meanings, of a philosophy, it is much less clear whether the understanding of the stability and the authority of one unique philosophical subject, by virtue of the existence of a translation of his or her work, is necessarily the reason why, as Venuti claims, translation remains philosophy's dark secret. In this respect, the author's reasoning seems unclear, and when it is put to some scrutiny, its foundations appear weak. First of all, starting from the principle affirmed clearly by Gadamer that there is no difference in nature, but only a difference in degree between the act of translating and the hermeneutic act of interpretation, then it follows that any translation is an act of interpretation, and that the translation of philosophy is nothing other than an interpretation of that philosophy, albeit in another language. Universal agreement concerning the interpretation, or even the interpretations, of a philosophy and the unity of its fundamental intention are rare indeed. Throughout the history of philosophy, the existence of different readings, often incompatible and even contradictory, of this or that author or of this or that particular work are far from rare, and might even be said to represent the normal state of affairs. One could hardly claim that the existence of starkly different interpretations of a thinker and of his or her work is something which disturbs philosophers or which endangers the stability and authority of the author in question or of the unique philosophizing subject. An example will be helpful here, and there are many of them, but perhaps some of the best are also some of the earliest, namely the pre-Socratic philosophers. In particular, let us mention very briefly Thales of Miletus. As we know, Aristotle tells us that, according to Thales of Miletus, the principle of all things was water. But the challenge then, of course, is to understand in what precise manner all things are related to water, how they come from and return to water. As many commentators have made clear, this task is far from straightforward. And similar remarks about the other pre-Socratics can also be made. Furthermore, some thinkers interpret Thales of Miletus, as well as his successors, as the first physicians, as the first men putting into practice empirical methods of observation akin to those we recognize today in the hard sciences. Immanuel Kant, on the other hand, was more interested in Thales of Miletus's discoveries in mathematics than in his methods and conclusions in cosmogony. Finally, for a thinker like Heidegger, the lasting significance of the pre-Socratics is to be found yet elsewhere. They are, he believed, the first thinkers of being. It thus seems clear that, in spite of almost universal agreement about their place at the cradle of Western philosophy, disagreement about the substance of their thinking and its overall meaning is sharp indeed. Although there are multiple readings and interpretations, it is not necessarily the case that the stability and the authority of the unique philosophical orators or authors in question is in any way shaken or weakened. Moreover, during the 20th century, thinkers such as Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida all developed philosophies which question and cast doubt on the stability and authority associated with the individual philosophical subject as it has been understood in the tradition, often as an autonomous agent of rational reflection. In the case of Merleau-Ponty, for example, it is the cogito expounded by Descartes and the pure transcendental consciousness set forth by Husserl which are sharply criticized. His critiques are developed in favor of a renewed understanding of subjectivity which privileges not only a unity between consciousness and the body, but also, and even more profoundly, an essential ontological affinity between the being of the subject and the being of the world in which it exists. Merleau-Ponty's successors go further still, and for them it is the very legitimacy of what we might call, simplistically, a decentered phenomenological subject which must be overcome once and for all. With the history of philosophy offering striking examples of figures who have been construed in such diverse fashions, and even of philosophers themselves who have sought to divest the rational subject of its autonomy and remove it from the highest platform on the podium at the centre of the cosmos, there can be little doubt that, if translation is the dark secret of philosophy, it is clearly not because any foundational assumptions relating to the solidity or the dominance of the philosophical subject are being crushed by the translations themselves due to the nature of language. A moment ago, I accentuated the conditional nature of the assertion at hand. If translation is the dark secret of philosophy. This was done purposefully, because not only am I not convinced about the reason why translation might be the dark secret of philosophy, but I am not even sure that translation is such a secret for philosophy. To be sure, the theme of translation has remained in the philosophical shadows, far removed from the central preoccupations of the majority of thinkers for a long time. But does this necessarily imply that it is a dark secret for them? Let us look briefly at a few of the authors previously discussed. René Descartes, as mentioned, wrote in Latin and in French, and he reviewed the first French translation of his Meditations, published in 1647, and carried out by a man called Louis Charles d'Albert. Descartes even judged that this translation was preferable to another one circulating at the time, carried out by a man called Claude Claire-Sellier. When John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding was published in December 1689, its translation was quickly taken up by a French man of letters called Pierre Coste. Coste's work remains today the only complete French translation of Locke's essay, and it is a remarkable piece of scholarship. In order to carry it out, Coste actually travelled to England to meet Locke, and he consulted with the author as he translated. The pitfalls inherent in rendering the essay into French, some of which were serious indeed, would have been no secret to Locke. And to take an example closer to us in time, from the 20th century, when reading the late working notes of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, they sometimes seem like a lexicon of German philosophical terms, the meaning of which the author is attempting as best he can to explain in the French language. It is true that none of these philosophers, and there are many other examples like them, concentrated on translation as a theme of research. But it would be perplexing to say that translation was a secret for them, let alone a dark secret, because they were often confronted with some very serious problems of translation. On the contrary, I would affirm that it might actually be philosophy which remains a dark secret for translation. In the final analysis, the justification for such an assertion is somewhat easier to comprehend. Philosophy as a discipline, more than any other, has a host of inescapable idiosyncrasies. To name only a few, the abstract nature of its concepts and the profundity of its subject matter, its tendency to construct systems, as well as what Jonathan Ray, following Roman Ingarden, calls its positive obscurity. And, as a direct consequence of this, it is the discipline which puts translation to task more so than any other, and, in doing so, exposes the methodological and existential difficulties of the translator's lot. When faced with the philosophical prose, and even more so than any other type of prose, the translator, or the philosopher-translator, is the person who must exist not only between two languages at one and the same time, but, even more seriously, between what Schleiermacher would call two conceptual systems, which each form a totality, but which nevertheless remain distinct from one another. It may even be the case that the philosopher-translator must exist between more than two languages and two conceptual systems at the same time, given the debt that modern languages owe to various ancient ones. As such, the translator must possess the rare ability to inhabit two conceptual systems at one and the same time, and be capable of understanding the world from within each one, remaining conscious of their differences and being able to communicate between them. Only in this manner would the work of the translator have any hope of succeeding. And it is an exacting task indeed. The English explorer and man of letters, Thomas Edward Lawrence, himself somewhat of a polyglot, declared in his masterpiece, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, a triumph, that he believed madness was very near, and I quote, "to the man who could see things through the veils at once of two customs, two educations, two environments." Finally then, philosophy's unique status as a discipline which puts translation to the test in a unique manner may be one of the factors which has forced translation deep into the shadows of philosophers' concerns, and it is surely part of the reason why philosophy remains such an enigma or such a secret for translation. In the final analysis, the difficulties lie in the very nature of the language used. In the words of Jean-Paul Sartre, and in French, curieusement, le langage le plus difficile, d'une certaine manière, c'est celui qui veut le plus communiquer, c'est la philosophie. In English, strangely, the most difficult language is, in a certain way, the one that attempts to communicate the most, That is philosophy. Thank you very much.